Did you say appetizer? What is that, your version of English? A millionaire's cruel joke echoes across a luxury restaurant as he mocks a soft-spoken waiter's accent. But what happens next leaves everyone speechless. That same waiter, Diego Morales, doesn't just respond. He stuns the entire room by fluently switching between 8 languages, calming a foreign investor, resolving guest conflicts, and exposing the arrogance of privilege without ever raising his voice. But Diego's story is deeper than a public reckoning. Behind his apron lies a past as a world-class linguistic diplomat forced into silence, and now a quiet return to a stage far greater than any courtroom or conference. This is a story of quiet strength, poetic justice, and how one man's humility transformed a world that tried to ignore him. You will never look at a simple waiter the same way again.
Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Did you say appetizer? What is that? Your version of English? Or just another kitchen joke? The words hit like a slap across a silent dining hall. Charles Wentworth reclined in his leather-backed chair, one hand curled arrogantly around a crystal tumbler of scotch, the other gesturing lazily at the young man standing beside his table, an unassuming waiter in a crisp black apron holding a notepad with quiet dignity. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was the restrained, polished kind that belonged to men who wore Rolexes and discussed hedge funds over dessert. Yet it pierced the heart more sharply than any roar. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at Diego. For a moment, Diego didn't move. His dark eyes flickered, betraying the briefest glint of something not shame, not anger, just a stillness like the eye of a storm that never quite passed. He gently tucked the notepad into his apron, bowed his head slightly, and responded in soft, measured English. "Apologies, sir. I will ensure your order is perfect." Charles smirked, tilting back his drink. "Just make sure it's in a language we all speak a." A few more chuckles, and then the knives resumed their dance against porcelain plates. Diego turned away without another word. His walk was neither hurried nor shaken, just smooth and practiced like water avoiding rocks. Behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, the clatter of silver and steam was louder, but no one missed what had just happened. "Why does he always pick on Diego?" whispered Marina, a pastry assistant barely out of culinary school. She watched Diego reset the tray with robotic care as though nothing had been said at all. An older chef leaned over. "Because Diego doesn't fight back. Charles Wentworth likes an easy target." "But Diego, he speaks like 4 languages, right? And he's always reading these crazy old books during break." 8, actually," muttered Manuel, the grizzled dishwasher, his voice dry as sand. "And those books, ancient philosophy, linguistics, political history." Marina's brow wrinkled. "Then why is he a waiter?" Manuel only shrugged, but the silence that followed was heavy with stories no one had dared to tell. In the dining room, Charles Wentworth twirled his fork through imported risotto, boasting to his 3 companions, 2 fellow investors, and a retired diplomat, about his latest real estate venture in Prague. "Of course, I had to fly in and clean up the mess myself. These Europeans, great at pastries, terrible at property law." "Didn't you have a translator with you?" one of them asked. Charles scoffed. "Please, you think I rely on locals? I speak money. That's universal." Diego returned moments later with their wine, presenting the bottle with a respectful nod. "This is the 2012 Chateau Margaux Premier Cru," he said, his voice clear. "Would you like me to decant it?" Charles glanced at the label and squinted. "Wait, isn't that pronounced Chateau Margaux?" The entire table went still for a beat too long. "Chateau Margaux, sir," Diego corrected gently in the elegant tones of a Parisian native. "Premier Cru refers to the classification from the Bordeaux region." The correction was subtle, respectful, precise, and devastating. Charles's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Right. Of course, the Bordeaux.
He waved his hand in dismissal. Just pour. As Diego uncorked the bottle with quiet grace, the diplomat at the table studied him more closely. There was something deliberate in the way the young man held the bottle, something practiced, as though this wasn't a chore. It was a performance. Each motion had the symmetry of ritual, not routine. Interesting fellow, the diplomat murmured after Diego left. He's not just another waiter. Charles shrugged. They all play that game. You let them speak a few words of French or Italian and suddenly they think they're cultured. In the back room, Diego took a long breath. The wine cellar's cool air wrapped around him, but it wasn't enough to dim the heat rising in his chest. Still, he didn't let it show. He never did. Instead, he traced his fingers over the spines of the vintage bottles, whispering their names aloud in a half-dozen dialects. He remembered once teaching an entire seminar on the regional inflections of Southern French, before the collapse, before the passport burned in the fire, before the silence he chose for himself. "Dinner rush is almost over," said the head waiter, stepping in. "You good to take the VIP lounge?" Diego nodded. "Of course." Meanwhile, the manager of the restaurant was being informed of an unexpected arrival. "Mr. Sakamoto just walked in," said the maitre d', trying to hide his panic. The translator stuck in traffic. The manager's eyes widened. "The Japanese investor. Why didn't anyone tell me he was still coming? He wasn't supposed to. He changed his flight." Just as panic began to spread through the staff like spilled wine, Charles stood up from his table and approached the front with smug confidence. "I'll speak to him," he said with a wink. "I've handled Sakamoto before." "Do you speak Japanese?" the manager asked. "I've seen enough sushi menus," Charles replied with a laugh. Seconds later, Mr. Sakamoto entered. A quiet, elderly man in a sharply tailored suit, his demeanor was respectful, composed. The kind of presence that made a room lean forward. Charles greeted him with a flamboyant bow, and then offered a clumsy phrase that sounded vaguely Japanese but was mostly mangled syllables in American bravado. Mr. Sakamoto blinked, then looked past him. Diego, quietly carrying a silver tray, had just turned the corner. His eyes met the investor's. He hesitated, but only for a second. Then he stepped forward and bowed, low, perfectly, with reverence and precision. "Good evening, Mr. Sakamoto. We've been expecting you. Please, right this way." The room froze. Charles's jaw hung open, the ridiculous bow he'd attempted now burning with embarrassment. The staff stared. Even the guests glanced around, unsure of what they'd just heard, but knowing instinctively it was something real. Mr. Sakamoto's face broke into a rare, soft smile. "You speak Japanese?" Diego nodded modestly. "Yes, I studied it at university." With a warm chuckle, Sakamoto walked beside him, completely ignoring Charles. And the balance of power in the room shifted without a sound. The door to the private lounge shut gently behind them, sealing in a silence that didn't just mute sound. It commanded attention. Mr. Sakamoto sat at the far end of the room, his calm eyes studying Diego, not as a servant, but as one might examine a rare book-weathered quiet, but brimming with untold stories. Diego poured the tea in elegant silence, his hand steady. As steam curled between them, he continued speaking in soft, fluent Japanese, asking if Mr. Sakamoto preferred sencha or gyokuro, whether he would like to dine alone or have company. Outside the lounge, chaos buzzed in whispers. Staff clustered near the doors, pretending to polish glassware or adjust lighting while trying to eavesdrop. Charles stood stiffly with the manager, his posture still tall, but his face betrayed something cracking. An unfamiliar, unsteady feeling called doubt. "Who is he?" Charles finally asked under his breath. The manager exhaled. "His name's Diego Morales. I don't know much. He came highly recommended a few years ago. Quiet, never late, always professional. Doesn't talk about himself. But he speaks Japanese like a native." The manager nodded, still watching the lounge window as Diego and Sakamoto exchanged words with calm fluidity. "And that's not the only language I've heard him speak." Charles scoffed, but it sounded weak this time. "He's just showing off." But there was no performance in Diego's demeanor, only grace. Sakamoto smiled more now, gesturing with respectful interest. The tension between them long dissolved. Every once in a while, Diego would laugh, gently nod, and answer, always with poise, always with purpose. It wasn't service. It was diplomacy. Back in the main hall, a pair of French tourists at table 11 argued softly over a menu item. Their confusion grew with each attempt to translate the dish, their words tangled in a mix of broken English and Parisian frustration. The waitress attending them looked helpless, flustered, and fumbling. Then Diego appeared, silently, casually. "Bonsoir, madame et monsieur," he said, gliding to the table. "Vous cherchez quelque chose de végétarien, n'est-ce pas?" "Good evening. You're looking for something vegetarian, correct?" The couple looked up in surprise, their eyes lit with relief. "Ah, oui, enfin. Quelqu'un qui comprend." With gentle hands and a warm voice, Diego explained 3 dishes in their native tongue, described ingredients, and even offered a pairing recommendation with a Loire Valley white. By the time he left, the tourists were glowing with gratitude. He walked barely 10 steps before he caught a woman at table 3, glancing nervously toward the floor. Her husband was grumbling in thick Russian about losing his cufflink. Without hesitation, Diego bent down, retrieved the piece of polished silver, and presented it with a phrase in fluent Russian. "You must have dropped this. Allow me." The man blinked in astonishment, and his voice softened. A young boy at table 5, confused by the kid's menu written in English, tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered something in German. Diego was already there, kneeling beside the boy, explaining the pasta dishes in a warm, fatherly tone the boy understood and trusted. With each encounter, it became clearer. Diego wasn't just multilingual. He was fluent in people. The air around him shimmered with connection, crossing barriers, lifting moods, bridging cultures with nothing but tone, eye contact, and sincerity. Even Charles's companions had grown quiet. One of them, a silver-haired financier named Richard Blake, leaned back slowly in his chair. "That's not something you pick up from apps," he murmured. "You either live that many lives or you're a genius." The retired diplomat, who had served in Vienna, Geneva, and Pretoria, folded his arms thoughtfully. "It's not just language. Watch how he listens. He reads people like a novel." Charles tried to brush it off, clinging to his authority like a raft in rising water. "It's just parlor tricks. He's still just a waiter." But even he couldn't ignore what was unfolding. Each time Diego moved, it was as though gravity shifted. People sat up straighter. Conversations paused. It wasn't power he carried. It was peace. The restaurant's atmosphere had transformed. Where once there was tension, there was now warmth, curiosity, admiration. And yet Diego himself seemed unaware of it all, or perhaps simply uninterested. Then came the final blow. From across the room, the sommelier, a young cocky wine steward, rushed up to Diego in a rare moment of humility. "Hey, Diego?" he asked, voice low. "There's a guest asking about an Armenian red we just stocked. I can't pronounce it. And I don't even know the region." Diego nodded. "Do you have the bottle?" A minute later, he approached a woman sitting alone at table 14, dressed in elegant earth tones. She held the bottle like a puzzle, her expression uncertain. Diego said gently, bowing. "Good evening. This is from the Tavush region, an excellent flavor profile." Her eyes widened a hand over her heart. "You speak Armenian?" "I lived in Gyumri briefly. My host family loved this wine." The moment was fragile and stunning. A quiet applause began, not loud but respectful. Staff near the bar clapped softly. A couple stood to shake his hand. The French tourists lifted their glasses toward him. In the lounge, Mr. Sakamoto emerged with the manager, his face brighter than before. "This young man," he said in accented English, "is extraordinary. If he ever wishes to work with my team, he will be welcomed." The entire room turned to look at Diego, and standing alone beside table 7, Charles Wentworth looked suddenly very small. He approached Diego, attempting the familiar bravado but lacking the tone. "Look, Diego, right?" he started. "That was impressive, really impressive. Guess I owe you one." Diego didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, he simply looked. The man in the eye nodded and replied, "There is no debt, sir, but I do hope one day when someone speaks differently than you, you'll listen first." The words were gentle, but they struck like thunder. Charles blinked as if slapped by truth itself. He stepped back slightly, then turned and left without another word. The staff, the guests, even the manager, all watched him go. And in the quiet that followed, Diego returned to his tray. No victory speech, no prideful smile, only the deep, still silence of someone who never needed a stage to matter. The clink of a glass falling in the kitchen snapped Marina out of her trance. She'd been standing at the pass window, frozen, her apron dusted, in flower hands, unmoving. She wasn't the only one. Everyone had paused. Everyone had felt it, that shift, that moment when the world quietly tilted, and Diego, the quiet waiter with the shy smile and tired shoes, became something else. The last of the guests had left. The French couple had tipped him in euros. The German boy had drawn a picture of him with a cape and handed it over with reverence. Mr. Sakamoto left his business card tucked beneath the teacup, along with a handwritten note in kanji that read, "Talent humbles power. You possess both." Yet Diego didn't bask in the attention. He didn't linger near the compliments. He cleared the tables, wiped the silverware, and swept beneath chairs like he had every night for 3 years without ceremony. It was others who stood still now, watching him, uncertain how to behave around someone they suddenly realized had never been ordinary. Later that night, when the chairs were stacked and the last light was dimmed, the restaurant hummed with whispers. Charles was long gone. His shadow had evaporated, leaving behind only the echo of his mockery, now softened by its own irrelevance. In the back near the walk-in fridge, the manager leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Diego wash the last wine glass by hand. "You didn't have to step in tonight," he said finally. Diego didn't look up. "He needed help. I met with Mr. Sakamoto, or the French couple, or the kid with the German menu. You could have just stayed silent, and no one would have blamed you." Diego smiled faintly, dried the glass, and set it gently on the rack. "But I would have blamed myself." The manager nodded slowly, then he stepped closer and lowered his voice. "They don't know about you, do they?" Diego's shoulders tightened just slightly, but he didn't turn. "I don't talk about it. I think it's time someone did." For a moment, there was silence between them. The silence of two men who understood the weight of things unspoken. Then quietly, the manager began to tell Marina, still hovering nearby, her hands trembling with curiosity, the story he had pieced together over time, a story no one else in the restaurant had ever heard in full. "His real name is Diego Morales, but that's not what they called him in the journals. Back then he was known as El Traductor del Silencio, the translator of silence." Marina blinked. "That's poetic." The manager nodded. It was more than poetry. It was politics, diplomacy. He wasn't just a linguist. He was a cultural advisor for the United Nations. He was flown into conflict zones before summits, places where one wrong word could reignite war. He could sit in a room with delegates from 6 countries and make everyone feel heard. "What happened?" the manager exhaled. "He was in Caracas when the university protests erupted. He spoke out publicly, boldly, not in anger but in truth. The wrong people listened. There was a fire. His office burned. His students disappeared. He escaped only because he had a second passport and a friend in the embassy." Marina covered her mouth. "That's why he came here. He arrived with nothing, no credentials, just a suitcase, and one request, a job where he could listen more than speak." She turned to look at Diego, who had now moved to reorganize the condiments on a back shelf with monk-like precision. "He could have worked anywhere," she whispered. "Universities, embassies. Why stay hidden?" The manager's voice softened. "Because when you've spent your life talking to power and watched it crush the people you loved, silence starts to feel sacred." There was no further explanation needed. That night, Diego walked home as he always did. No car, no driver, just the rhythmic echo of his steps on cobblestone streets. A satchel slung over his shoulder filled with borrowed books and worn notebooks. A soft rain fell, the kind that made the city shimmer. Streetlights blurred like lanterns behind fog. Inside his modest apartment above a flower shop, he brewed herbal tea and sat beside a small wooden desk. On the wall hung only one framed photo, a classroom of young students in Venezuela, all smiling. At the center of the image stood a younger version of Diego, arms folded, hope in his posture. He didn't turn on the TV, he didn't check his phone. He opened a worn leather-bound notebook and scribbled something in Armenian, then in Russian, then Japanese. Not for practice, but to keep the languages alive inside him, like an old piano player pressing keys to keep the chords from fading. Back at the restaurant, the staff hadn't left. They were still seated around the chef's table, Marina clutching her apron in awe. "He saved that night," one said. "He saved us," said another. And yet Diego never asked to be recognized, never asked to be understood. He only wanted to serve with grace. And in that silence he spoke more than the loudest man in the room ever could. It began with small things. The maitre d' once, brisk and borderline rude to most of the waitstaff, started pausing to ask how Diego would greet foreign guests. He began practicing greetings in different tongues, scribbling phonetics on note cards with an earnestness that surprised even himself. The head chef, notorious for snapping at anyone who got a sauce wrong, suddenly asked Diego to help translate a recipe handwritten by a retired Michelin star chef from Tuscany. Diego obliged without ceremony, reading it aloud in soft, reverent Italian that made the kitchen fall still. Even the dishwasher, old Manuel, stood a little taller, as though the quiet weight of Diego's dignity had begun to lift something in all of them, as if they'd all realized that excellence didn't need applause to matter. Sometimes it just needed to be witnessed. By the end of the week, guests began asking for Diego by name. Some wanted wine recommendations in their native language. Some just wanted to speak with him, as though drawn to a mystery they couldn't explain. They weren't asking for performance. They were seeking presence. And Diego, ever humble, gave it in full measure. One evening, as golden light spilled across white linen and strings of soft violin music fluttered from the speakers, the restaurant felt different. Warmer, softer, alive. But just as the roots of something sacred began to form, something else arrived. A letter. It came in a navy envelope with a golden seal hand-delivered. No postage, no return address. It was the kind of letter that seemed too heavy for its own weight, as if the paper remembered the hands that had touched it. The manager found it at the host stand and handed it to Diego without a word. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside a single page. Diego Morales, your presence at the Global Linguistic Peace Summit in Geneva has been requested. Your former colleagues have recommended you to lead a forum on cross-cultural diplomacy and refugee communication strategy. We believe your voice is needed now more than ever. At the bottom, a signature in looping ink and the emblem of the summit's International Council. For a long time, Diego didn't move. He didn't breathe. The kitchen clock ticked. Silverware clinked distantly from the dining room. And inside Diego, the war began. That night he sat alone in his apartment, the letter lying on the table like a ghost from another life. He poured a cup of yerba mate but didn't drink it. Instead he sat in silence, remembering the day he crossed the border with forged documents in a burning city behind him, the friends he left in prison cells whose names he could no longer say aloud, the speech he never gave because the microphone was smashed before his turn came, and the way he promised himself he would never again stand at the edge of power only to watch it crush the fragile hopes beneath it. The summit wanted him. The world was asking again. But could he answer? He opened a drawer filled with folded letters, some unread, some answered in languages others had long since forgotten. From embassies, from universities, from exiles. But none of them had touched him the way that restaurant did. None had shown him the quiet grace of being unknown, yet deeply needed. The next morning the restaurant buzzed with rumors. Marina had overheard the manager mention Geneva and now the staff watched Diego more carefully as though afraid he might vanish into the wind. When he arrived right on time, as always, there was a small bouquet of flowers in his locker. A note: "Thank you for speaking for all of us without ever raising your voice." No signature. That afternoon, a familiar figure returned. Charles Wentworth. Gone was the bluster. Gone the arrogant laugh. He arrived alone, wearing a navy coat and no tie, and waited quietly to be seated. When he asked for Diego, it wasn't in command, but in request. "I was hoping to speak with him, if he has time," he told the host. When Diego approached the table, Charles stood up. "I wanted to apologize," he said simply. "No grand gestures, no rehearsed speech, just 6 words, honest, human." Diego nodded. "Thank you." Charles took a breath. "I thought knowledge came with noise, that it had to be loud to matter. But you—" He paused, swallowing his pride like bitter wine. "You said more in silence than I ever could shouting, and I needed to hear that." For the first time, Diego smiled, not politely but truly. "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do," he said gently, "is refuse to be angry." Charles looked at him, and something in his face broke, not in weakness, but in understanding. When he left, he shook Diego's hand, not as a millionaire, not as a customer, as a man changed. That night, the manager pulled Diego aside after service. "I heard about the letter," he said quietly. "You don't owe us anything, you know." "I know. But if you go, this place won't be the same." Diego looked around the restaurant, its polished surfaces, the glow of candlelight on wood, the subtle conversations happening in a dozen different tongues, and he whispered, it was never supposed to stay the same. He walked home under a moon that seemed to follow him, his coat tucked tight against the breeze. The city murmured in languages of traffic laughter and footsteps. Every corner he passed, he greeted someone. An old woman with her cat, a child selling gum, a grocer locking his stall. Each language, each gesture, a thread in the tapestry he'd quietly stitched across this place. When he reached his door, he looked back once, not to mourn, but to remember. He didn't yet know whether he would go, but the world had spoken. Now it was his turn to answer. The day Diego handed in his notice, there were no fireworks, no teary send-off, no grand announcements. Just a folded piece of paper left on the manager's desk, signed with calm precision, effective in 2 weeks. With gratitude, Diego. Yet within hours the energy shifted. It was Marina who found the letter first. She was supposed to be slicing strawberries for the midday dessert prep, but instead she stared at the paper as though it were written in fire. "He's really leaving," she whispered, and her voice trembled like a string pulled too tight. By evening, the staff had stopped pretending not to know. The kitchen worked in silence, the usual clatter subdued into something quieter, heavier. Even the head chef barked fewer orders, as if unsure what command could matter now. Guests continued to arrive, smiling, dressed in linen and silk, asking, "Is Diego here tonight?" with the eagerness of old friends. He was, but he had never felt farther away. Diego moved with the same grace, the same humility. But there was something new in his silence. An ache. The kind of ache that comes when you know you are already missing a place before you've even left it. On his third to last night, an elderly man walked into the restaurant wearing a scarf dotted with UN insignia pins. He approached Diego after dessert and asked, "Do you still remember Darfur?" Diego's face softened. "Every day." The man nodded. "Then you remember how you held that child's hand and translated his story to the world. How that story reached Geneva. It saved lives." "I was only a voice," Diego said quietly. "No. You were a bridge." The man pressed a pin into Diego's hand. "Come back. We need bridges more than ever." That night, as Diego walked home, he passed a boy playing guitar outside the florist. The chords were clumsy but earnest. Diego paused, listened, then knelt beside him and adjusted the boy's fingers, guiding them into harmony. No words were exchanged, just the music. 2 more nights passed. On the eve of his final shift, the restaurant glowed like never before. It wasn't the lighting, it was the people. They came in waves. Past guests, families, strangers who had heard. A couple from Brazil who remembered how Diego comforted their homesick daughter in Portuguese. A Ukrainian woman who had cried in the lounge until he sat beside her and whispered words of comfort in her native tongue. A deaf couple who swore Diego had once signed their entire order flawlessly. No reservations had been made, and yet every table was full. The manager, overwhelmed, pulled Diego aside. "We're booked out without a single name on the list." Diego nodded. They came for a goodbye, but it was more than that. They came to honor a man who had never asked for thanks, a man who showed them that dignity didn't roar. It whispered, and the world still listened. Charles returned too, this time with his daughter. He asked to sit at the quiet corner near the window and barely spoke, only smiled when Diego came to take their order. He didn't try to impress, he didn't interrupt. He simply asked if Diego would choose a dish for them. "Whatever you think we should taste before you go." Diego returned with a small, modest plate, an arepa from his homeland filled with soft cheese and seasoned beans. "I wanted her to taste home," he said softly. Charles looked at him, then at his daughter, and nodded. "Thank you." The night unfolded like a symphony, each table a different movement, every guest a note of memory playing back the kindness they once received from the man in the black apron. At the end of the night, the lights dimmed, and for the first time the manager made a toast, not to profits or promotions, but to a waiter. "To Diego Morales," he said, raising his glass, "who reminded us that language is not just spoken, it's how you carry a tray, how you remember a face, how you listen when no one else does." Everyone stood, the staff, the guests, the busboys, even the dishwasher, and together in a dozen accents they whispered, "Thank you." Diego didn't cry. He only bowed low and full and whispered back, "You were my home too." When he left that night, the streets were still, the lights flickered like fireflies, and in the silence of the city something lingered behind him, something invisible but undeniable. A presence, a legacy. The florist's door opened as he passed, and the woman inside called out, "Wait, Diego!" He turned. She held up a package. "A delivery. It came for you this morning." He opened it slowly on the sidewalk beneath a flickering street lamp. Inside, an old book bound in green leather. The title embossed in gold read, "Linguistic Bridges, the Morales Method." He froze. Inside, the dedication read, "To Diego, who taught us that to translate is not to speak for someone, but to carry their truth without altering its weight. Your silence changed us all." It was authored by 3 of his former students. He stood there clutching it long after the lights inside the shop went dark. And when he finally walked home, it was not with sadness, but with quiet readiness. The world had called him back, and now finally he was ready to answer. Geneva greeted Diego with a kind of stillness he hadn't felt in years. The airport was clean quiet, a far cry from the cities where he'd once dodged black cars and curfews, where his breath came in shallow bursts, and every uniform meant uncertainty. Here even the air felt precise, thin, deliberate, like every molecule had signed a peace treaty. He moved through customs unnoticed. A man in plain clothes carrying only a leather satchel and a book tucked under one arm. The Morales Method. He hadn't meant to bring it. At the last second, his hand had reached for it on instinct, as if it needed to be carried with him like a memory too proud to be left behind. A car waited outside. Not a limousine, just a sleek black sedan with tinted windows and an unassuming driver holding a placard, "D. Morales." He slid into the back seat, and Geneva unfurled outside the window like an old letter reopened after too many years. Neutral flags, crystal blue lakes, people walking with intent, their faces calm, their languages lilting from calf to corridor. But inside Diego the storm churned. They had summoned him back into the realm of polished speeches and veiled power plays, into rooms where truth was a currency and silence could be twisted into consent. He had sworn he would never return, and yet here he was, ghost among diplomats. The car pulled up to the Grand Palais, the summit venue, a place that had once been a marble altar for Diego's faith in dialogue. He stepped out slowly, his breath catching as the building rose before him, tall and indifferent. A woman met him at the door, tall, dark-haired eyes sharp with familiarity. "Professor Morales," she said. It felt like being called by a name he'd buried in a field somewhere. "Lena," he answered, recognizing her. She had been one of his most brilliant students. Now she wore a badge that read, Deputy Chair Cultural Ethics Committee. "You haven't changed," she said, though there was sadness behind her smile. "Except, your silence got louder." They didn't hug. Too many years. Too much left unsaid. She led him inside. The corridors pulsed with conversations in every language, diplomats in tailored suits, interpreters with headsets, young interns darting between briefcases and microphones. Diego walked through them like a ghost no one noticed, until he entered the main conference hall. Then silence rippled through the space like wind in a cathedral. Eyes turned. Not all of them kind. Some remembered the man who had once stood at the Security Council and made a general weep by translating a mother's plea. Some remembered the scandal that followed, the accusations, the exile, the disappearance. Now he had returned. He was led to a private chamber, an oval room with wide windows overlooking the city. There a panel of organizers waited. Lena stood beside them. "Before we go public with your appearance," one of the men began, "we wanted to ask, are you willing to speak?" Diego paused. The words sat in his mouth like stone. "Speak? In what sense?" The man adjusted his glasses. "You would lead the Forum on Refugee Communication. Your methods, your stories, your ethics, shared with the world again. We need your voice, Diego." He looked out the window past the rooftops of embassies and consulates into the horizon where the lake shimmered beneath the sky. "I'm not sure my voice belongs here anymore." Lena stepped forward. "Then let me ask you differently," she said softly. "If the boy from Aleppo stands in this room tomorrow, and you stay silent, who speaks for him?" The silence that followed was not passive. It burned. Diego spent the night in a small flat they had arranged for him in the Old Town. It was tasteful minimalist with a view of the cathedral and a desk facing the Alps. But it felt foreign. He paced the floor long after the moon rose. He remembered his father's voice, deep and accented, teaching him that words were sacred, that when you used them well they could feed the poor, disarm a tyrant, or save a soul from despair. He remembered the student in Sudan who translated poetry into 4 dialects so her grandmother could understand beauty before she died. He remembered the silence in the courtroom when he refused to name names and how that silence cost him everything. The next morning he returned to the Palais. He passed the registration tables, past the journalists, past the whispers. He stepped onto the stage of the Forum, the lights warm against his face. No teleprompter, no cue cards, just a chair, a microphone, and 1,000 eyes waiting. He took a breath, then another. Then he stepped away from the microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. He looked not at the cameras, but at the people. And he spoke. Not loudly, not formally, but with the voice of a man who had remembered his purpose. He spoke of kitchens where waiters translated hearts without words, of janitors who knew 5 languages and were never asked their stories, of children who cried in corners of refugee camps, not because they were hungry, but because no one around them could understand their grief. He didn't speak for power. He spoke for presence. He spoke for every human being who had been misunderstood, overlooked, silenced. And when he finished, the room was not filled with applause. It was still. The kind of stillness that came when truth had entered, sat down, and made itself at home, Then, slowly people stood. Not in unison, not in performance, but one by one. Out of respect, out of recognition, out of awe. And Diego Morales, once mocked for his accent, once buried beneath silence, stood taller than ever. He had not returned to reclaim status. He had returned to restore meaning. And the world was listening. The applause had long faded, but its echo followed Diego everywhere. Not the kind that came with thunderous ovations or spotlight interviews. No, this applause lingered in the quiet gestures, a nod from a delegate as they passed him in the corridor, a slip of paper from a young interpreter reading, "You spoke my mother's truth." By the second day of the summit, his name had returned to lanyards and whispered conversations. Not as a curiosity, not as a scandal, but as a catalyst. People quoted him in panels, translated his phrases into brochures, shared his words on live feeds across continents. A voice he thought he had buried was now a thread sewn into the fabric of international conversation. And yet inside he felt unease. Not because the attention frightened him, but because he remembered where it had led before. How quickly sincerity could be consumed by ambition, how movements could become machines, and how a man with principles could wake up a symbol twisted into something he never meant to become. In the green room before a keynote panel, Diego sat alone sipping tea. Outside, a media swarm gathered. A New York Times journalist wanted an exclusive. BBC had sent a crew. A foundation from Norway wanted to nominate him for a humanitarian medal. Lena entered tablet in hand, eyes filled with urgency. "You're everywhere," she said, almost in disbelief. "Your words are being taught in translation workshops already. Diego, this is more than a comeback." He didn't smile. "I never wanted a comeback." "I know," she said gently, "but people are listening again. Maybe this time, you get to shape how they hear you." He set the tea down. "I came here to serve, to give what I could, not to become a brand." Lena stepped forward. "I've watched you disappear, Diego, and I know why. But don't forget the lives your silence didn't reach." He looked at her, then really looked, and something cracked behind his eyes. Regret, maybe, or guilt, or just the unbearable weight of knowing how much good he could do, if he dared. That evening, the city of Geneva lit up in honor of the summit's closing. Candles were placed across the park facing the Palais, each one representing a language spoken by a displaced person who had arrived in Europe since the last decade. There were 147 candles. Diego walked among them slowly, the lake glistening behind him, the breeze lifting his coat. Each flame flickered like a memory, a language he once translated, a child he once taught to say hope. In 3 dialects, a mother he helped write a letter home in a tongue she hadn't spoken since fleeing her village. He knelt before one candle, a small one, almost out, and whispered in Quechua, the language of a boy he met only once on a mountain border. "Still here," he whispered. "I haven't forgotten." Behind him, footsteps. Charles. Not in a suit. Not in arrogance. Just a man in a wool coat, his daughter asleep in his arms. "I followed the speech online," he said quietly. "Didn't understand half of it, but my daughter, she cried." Diego turned. "I'm glad she could feel it." "I used to think people like you were soft," Charles said. "All words, no action. But now I see what you do is harder than any deal I ever closed." He stepped closer, adjusting the child gently. "You don't raise your voice," Charles murmured. "You raise others." Then he nodded and walked away. Diego stayed until the last candle burned low. The next morning his inbox was flooded offers to lead to publish, to become a permanent ambassador for the UN. But one message stood out. It was from Marina. A photo taken from the restaurant she and the kitchen staff had started language lessons together. The photo showed a chalkboard with "Hello" written in 8 different scripts. Under it, a note: "You taught us more than food service. You taught us to speak and to listen." Diego stared at the image, moved beyond words. That afternoon, Lena found him sitting beneath a tree behind the palais, a notepad on his lap. He didn't look up when she approached. "You're not staying, are you?" she asked. He shook his head. "I was never meant to stay in one place too long, but I was meant to start something." Lena sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "Where will you go?" He looked at her, the wind catching his collar. "Back, for now. Back to the place that reminded me who I was." She smiled. "Then let it remind others, too." That night he boarded the red-eye back to his adopted city. No press, no entourage. Just the soft hum of a cabin and the glow of a booklight over a worn leather cover. The Morales method. He had once fled from it. Now he held it gently. As the plane ascended, Diego Morales closed his eyes and whispered a single word spoken in no particular language, yet understood in all: ready. The cab slowed near the corner of Rue Saint-Michel, just as the sky began to soften from night into dawn. The old cobblestones were slick with mist, and the florist shop below Diego's apartment still had its steel shutters drawn down tight, but the window above his window welcomed him like an old friend. No fanfare. No fanfare ever needed. Diego paid the driver, stepped out into the chilled morning, and stood for a long time with his satchel over one shoulder and his other hand resting lightly on the weathered doorframe. The city was quiet, not sleeping, but listening, like it knew he had returned. He climbed the narrow staircase boots, echoing softly against the wood, and paused when he reached his door. For a moment he didn't reach for the key. He just stood there and breathed. Inhale, exhale. Home. The lock clicked open and the apartment greeted him, just as he had left it, sparse, warm, lived in. His books remained where he had stacked them, on the desk beside the armchair along the windowsill. A few loose papers with translations scrawled in ink. A teacup waiting to be filled again. But something had changed. Not inside the room. Inside him. He no longer feared his voice. He no longer feared what it meant to be seen. He unpacked the satchel slowly. First came the leather book. The Morales method gently placed on the desk beside the candle. Then came the pin from the peace summit, which he laid quietly atop a folded cloth. And finally, a handwritten letter from Lena. The world may have summoned you back, but it was never to reclaim your past. It was to reclaim the future you still hold. He smiled faintly. Then he did what he always did. When words were too much, he made tea. Downstairs, the city stirred to life. Bicycles passed, bakery bells rang, and a block away the restaurant began its early deliveries. Crates of vegetables thumped onto the sidewalk. Fresh linens were stacked by the kitchen door. The staff began trickling in. Marina among them, shoulders hunched from the cold, her satchel filled with flashcards and a dog-eared Spanish dictionary. When she pushed open the back entrance, she paused. Her eyes widened. There, sitting at the kitchen table with an apron folded beside him and a steaming mug in his hand, was Diego. She gasped so loudly she startled the pastry chef. "You're here." He nodded, warmth blooming in his eyes. "I am." "You came back." "I never really left." She rushed forward and hugged him. Not a polite embrace, not something delicate. A full, trembling, teary hug that spoke every language of gratitude without saying a word. "Everything's changed," she whispered. He smiled. "So I've heard." It was true. In his absence, the restaurant had evolved. Language lessons were now offered twice a week in the break room with flashcards in French, Spanish, Italian, and even Arabic. Guests were greeted in their native tongues whenever possible. Dishes were now labeled with phonetic pronunciations and short cultural notes, something that had already sparked praise in a local newspaper. But it wasn't just policy. It was posture. It was how the staff moved, how they listened, how they treated the quietest guests, not as forgettable, but as sacred. The head chef now asked for input from waitstaff. The dishwasher Manuel had become a mentor to the younger ones, sharing stories of his own childhood in Guatemala in slow, lyrical Spanish during cleanup. And Marina. She had become the voice of the staff, soft-spoken but fierce when needed. She had found her words. When the manager arrived and saw Diego standing by the espresso machine, he stopped in the doorway and just stared. "You look taller," he said. Diego shrugged. "Maybe I just stopped hiding. You here to stay? For now." "That's good enough for me." That night, the restaurant buzzed with the usual hum of plates, forks, and distant laughter. Diego wore his black apron once more, not as a costume, but as a coat of arms. A family of tourists struggled with their menu. Diego slipped over, greeted them in soft German, and translated every dish. An elderly woman dining alone asked if he knew any poems in French. He quoted Rimbaud by heart. A little girl wanted to know how to say butterfly in 5 languages. He told her 7. By the end of the evening, the guests didn't just thank him. They thanked the kitchen staff, the busboys, the hosts, because Diego had reminded them that dignity could begin at a table. After closing, as the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, the staff gathered for tea. No announcements, no declarations. Just Diego, pouring cups as stories were told in mixed languages. English braided with Italian Spanish, woven into Vietnamese laughter in all of them. And then, Marina pulled something from her bag. A notebook. On the front, scrawled in bold, hopeful letters, "The Listening Project." "What's this?" Diego asked. "We've been recording guest stories," she said. "You inspired it. Their languages, their memories, the little things they say over dinner. We want to publish it. A book. From us. From this place." Diego stared at the cover hands, trembling slightly. "You're all translators now," he whispered. Marina nodded. "We learned from the best." He didn't speak for a moment. He just sat there, hands around his cup, eyes glassy. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the bridge alone. The letter came on a Monday. Not in an envelope this time, just an email. Plain subject line, no attachments, no embellishment. Subject: an invitation from the world you changed. Diego almost didn't open it. He had spent the morning writing out Chinese calligraphy for the tea corner menu and translating a new set of dishes into Swahili just for the joy of it. The restaurant was quiet, humming with the peace of ordinary things. Knives, chopping ovens, sighing Marina, humming something in Italian. But the name in the signature stopped him. Elias Vanden, director of the International Language and Peace Institute. Diego remembered the man. A quiet giant in a sea of voices. Elias had once invited Diego to co-author a paper on empathetic translation, a concept Diego coined long before it was fashionable. They hadn't spoken in years. Now he was reaching out. "We are creating a new institute." The email read, "A global campus to train cultural interpreters, not just in language but in presence, patience, emotional nuance. A new diplomacy. And we want you to lead it." Diego sat motionless for several minutes. "Lead it." He blinked. He read it again. "We want you to lead it." The words hit different than the accolades. They weren't asking for a speech, a panel, or a symbolic figurehead. They were asking for him to shape something permanent. A legacy. His heart stirred, but not with ambition. With doubt. With that familiar ache that came whenever life tilted him toward public light. He closed the laptop, his fingers still trembling slightly. Later that evening, he stood outside the restaurant during break, the city soaked in the golden hush of dusk. His breath fogged faintly in the air. From inside, the sounds of plates and laughter spilled out like music from a warm room. Marina joined him, holding 2 mugs of ginger tea. "You've been quiet today," she said. He nodded. An offer came. Her eyebrows lifted. A job. A school. Her lips parted. You'd be teaching again. I'd be designing the curriculum, building the framework, choosing the staff, leading. That sounds like everything you left behind. Diego looked up at the sky, the first stars peeking through a lavender veil. Yes, and also everything I once dreamed. She didn't push him. She just stood beside him, two mugs between them, letting the moment bloom on its own. Inside, the dinner rush began. Orders rang out. A child laughed as she asked for her dessert in Mandarin, and Diego felt the pull-to anchors tugging in opposite directions. One the roots he'd grown in silence, the other the wings that had waited in folded corners of his heart. The next day, Elias called. I know it's a lot to ask, the man said. His voice was gentle, aged by patience. You've earned peace. You've earned quiet. I found something here I didn't think I'd have again, Diego replied. Family, stillness. You also found influence, Elias said. And that's never just yours to keep. There was no malice in it, no manipulation, just truth. Diego sat at the edge of his bed that night, surrounded by books in languages that danced across borders. On the wall, the photo of his old students from Venezuela smiled back at him. He spoke aloud. To serve or to lead? Or is there a way to do both? In the morning, he walked to the park. There, on the same bench where he used to sit, unnoticed, he found a small group gathered. Marina Manuel, a few waiters, even two retired guests who had become regulars. They had brought bread, tea, notebooks. We've been thinking, Marina said, placing a folder in his hands. What if we started our own class here, community-based? Multilingual empathy training, stories and service. Your method, our voice. Diego flipped open the folder. It was basic. Handwritten outlines, a class schedule, a mission scribbled at the top. Understanding is the first step to peace. He looked around at the faces. Ordinary, imperfect, beautiful. You already started without me, he whispered. We just needed your blessing, said Manuel. And for a moment Diego saw a third path, neither retreat nor spotlight. A bridge. He emailed Elias that night. I will help build your institute, but it must have roots in community, not just campuses. We will begin here, in a restaurant that speaks in whispers. The reply came quickly. Then let's build it your way. And so Diego began again. He taught his first community class in the back of the restaurant, using napkins and mismatched chairs. The first students were servers, chefs, housekeepers, and a curious journalist. The second week they doubled. By the third, a professor from the university joined. Then a former diplomat. Then a teenage girl who had never spoken a word outside her native Arabic, but smiled each time Diego said her name correctly. Lessons were not just about words. They were about posture, listening, timing, dignity. It spread slowly, beautifully, like candlelight passed from hand to hand, and far away in Geneva, a building was prepared. Not a palace, a sanctuary. The first international class would come in 6 months. But the first legacy had already begun. The evening sky was the color of deep velvet when Diego stepped onto the stage for the last time. Not a grand auditorium in Geneva, not a press conference, not a political forum. It was the back garden of the restaurant. String lights twinkled between olive trees. Folding chairs were set in gentle rows. A makeshift podium had been built from crates and a tablecloth. Someone had even arranged flowers, small, humble things, like the kind a child might pick with pride. The audience wasn't made of diplomats or dignitaries. It was made of faces he knew. Marina stood near the edge, a notebook in her hand, eyes wide like the first day she learned to say welcome in Mandarin. Manuel leaned on a cane, but his smile was steady. The old French couple held hands. The boy who once asked for butterfly in 5 languages was now taller, older, but still watching Diego like he held all the answers. And Charles was there too. This time without his ego. Just a father in the crowd sitting beside his daughter, both of them leaning forward listening. Diego looked at them all, then glanced down at his notes. He didn't use them. Instead, he let the silence settle in first. He had learned long ago the best stories begin in quiet. When I first came here, he said, his voice soft but clear, I had no name, no country, no purpose that I believed could be trusted again. A hush blanketed the crowd. He continued, I was a voice without a stage, a language without a listener. I cleaned tables not because I was beneath speaking, but because I had forgotten what it meant to be heard. He stepped around the podium and stood closer to them, not above, but among. Then you gave me something I hadn't had in years' space, to listen, to observe, to serve. And in that service I found myself again. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, catching glints of emotion in every gaze. You all taught me that dignity doesn't need titles. It needs practice. That empathy isn't a theory. It's a way of being. And that sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the deepest truth. A breeze stirred through the trees. Somewhere in the distance a bell chimed. He paused, letting it pass like a punctuation mark between hearts. When I first returned from Geneva, I thought I was walking away from something big. But now, I understand. I was walking toward something greater. He gestured to the students sitting cross-legged in the grass, notebooks open. Right here. We've started something new. Not an institution, not a program, a movement. A movement where the janitor can teach the diplomat, where a waitress can rewrite policy, where a child who speaks 3 languages at home but none at school can become the teacher. A few heads nodded, others lowered eyes damp. And the man who once mocked me for my accent, Diego said, his eyes resting softly on Charles. He became my reminder that people don't need punishment. They need awakening. Charles looked down, tears glistening. His daughter placed her hand on his. Diego smiled gently. I've translated speeches for presidents. I've negotiated peace between factions. But nothing has meant more to me than hearing someone say, I feel seen. That's the language I live for. He stepped back, his words settling over the garden like warm rain. There was no thunderous applause, just stillness. Then from the back, a child's voice rang out. Mr. Diego, how do you say hope in every language? Laughter bubbled softly, sweet and human. Diego knelt. Well, he said with a twinkle in his eye, you say it like this. And then he did. In French, in Arabic, in Xhosa, in Mandarin, in Quechua, in German, in silence, placing his hand over his heart and letting it rest there. And in that moment, no one moved, because they understood. Hope wasn't just a word. It was how Diego stood before them, steady, soft-spoken, unapologetically present. It was the waiter who had been mocked, the voice that had been dismissed, the man who had become a mirror showing everyone who they truly could be. That night, after the garden cleared and the chairs were folded and the candles had burned low, Diego remained behind. He sat on the old crate podium, sipping tea as stars shimmered above. Marina approached and handed him a small package. What's this? He asked. A gift. From all of us. He unwrapped it. Inside a plaque. To Diego Morales, the translator of silence, the architect of understanding. He traced the lettering with one finger, emotions unspoken. We never told you, she said, sitting beside him. But when you first arrived, we didn't think you'd stay. You were too quiet, too refined. We thought you were hiding. I was, he whispered. And yet, somehow, she smiled. You found all of us instead. The two sat in peace, the garden breathing gently around them. And as Diego looked up at the stars, his heart full Not with pride, but with presence. He finally understood. He had never needed a spotlight. He had been the light all along. And now, the world quiet, listening, alive, was ready to carry that flame forward. One whisper, one word, one understanding at a time. Sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that refuses to shout. Diego Morales reminded us that dignity doesn't need a stage, and impact doesn't come from noise, but from presence. In a world obsessed with dominance, he chose service. Mocked for his accent, ignored for his silence, he became the very bridge others would one day walk across. He taught us that fluency isn't just about language. It's about empathy, about listening to understand, not to reply. This story challenges us to see those we overlook, the waiter, the cleaner, the quiet soul in the corner. Within them may live a world of wisdom, brilliance, and resilience waiting to be recognized. So ask yourself, are you speaking over others, or are you hearing what's truly being said? Because the most unforgettable transformations often begin with a whisper. Let Diego's journey inspire yours. Be the translator of silence. Be the architect of understanding. And remember, when you respect others, you speak the only universal language that matters.